Here's a question. In British politics, with its system of cabinet government, who, when things go wrong, is accountable? The minister or the officials? Well, whatever answers passed in the long summer of 2020 and the great exams fiasco that went with it, it's the officials who have shouldered the blame. Education Secretary Gavin Williamson remains in place. But the head of Ofqual, Collier, stepped down yesterday, and today Downing Street confirmed that Jonathan Slater, the top civil servant at the Department for Education, is going too. What's striking about all this is that if you lay it out all logically and look at the timeline of events, then it is impossible to extricate individual ministerial decision-making and discretion. Indeed, if you take standardisation, the controversial process at the heart of this entire affair by which students' grades were determined not only by their own efforts, but by their school's past performance, then that is something that ministers not only were aware of, but that they actively asked for.
It's there in black and white in the direction that they gave Ofqual, that they wanted standardisation and they wanted no grade inflation. And the moment you make that decision, then you are forced into a position where you have to lower the grades that schools would give, and that's going to lead to people being unhappy. Now, the exact way that it was done perhaps could have been tweaked, but ultimately that decision drove everything else.
All of this process has been played out in the public domain. On the 23rd of March, Gavin Williamson made a written statement to Parliament where, among other things, he said, "We will also aim to ensure that the distribution of grades follows a similar pattern to that in other years." Consequently, later in the spring, Ofqual were clear. In their written guidance on the exam process, they said, all centre assessment grades will be put through an external standardisation process to better ensure that grades are comparable across schools and colleges and the national results are broadly similar to previous years. So, this is something which Ofqual had been asked to do by ministers and which therefore ministers were aware of. For example, in Parliament on May the 11th, Schools Minister Nick Gibbs said Ofqual is working with awarding organisations to develop a robust process for awarding grades. Wherever possible, schools, colleges and other institutions will produce fair and objective centre assessment grades which will be externally standardised to ensure consistency. And other politicians noticed and were concerned about it. For example, the Education Select Committee on July the 11th said a number of concerns about the Ofqual standardisation model were identified in the submissions we received. They encourage ministers to potentially think again about it. But ministers were apparently unconcerned. On the contrary, at the start of exams week, standardisation remained what ministers and the Prime Minister explicitly said they wanted.
Let's be in no doubt about it, the exam results that we've got today are robust, they're good, they're dependable for employers.
But by today, on a school visit, that had mutated, quite literally, where the Prime Minister seemed to describe a process as something about which ministers were almost unaware.
You couldn't sit your exams, which you yearned to do, and I'm afraid your grades were almost derailed by a mutant algorithm, and I know how stressful that must have been for pupils up and down the country.
It's worth remembering, of course, that England wasn't alone in going through an exams debacle. The scandal started in Scotland and gradually worked its way through all of the devolved administrations, and none of their education secretaries resigned either. But then neither did their officials. Many are now left wondering whether the doctrine of ministerial accountability has all but gone.
Ultimately, if a government seems incapable of losing a minister, whatever a minister does, it's never the minister that goes, it's always the official that goes. That's going to start to have real consequences for the relationship between the government and the civil service. And, you know, bearing in mind this is the fifth Perm Secretary in the time that this government has been in place who has been moved on, this could well, I think, begin to have consequences for the level of trust between government and the civil service.
It's always been said that ministers decide and officials or advisers advise. But it seems that in the age of Boris Johnson, more often than not, the officials must resign too, whether or not they, or they alone, made the decision.
And our political editor, Nick Watt, is here. And Nick, why have they done it? Why have they sacked him?
Well, Downing Street have had Jonathan Slater in their sights for some time. I'm told this goes right back to July last year when Boris Johnson sacked Damien Hines as Education Secretary. And the way that it was put to me was that in number 10, they see Damien Hines and Jonathan Slater as two peas in a blobbish pod. Now, the blob is the word that is used, the pejorative word that is used by Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings to refer to the educational establishment dating back to when Michael Gove was Education Secretary at the beginning of the coalition. And what I'm told is that they saw the disaster over Ofqual as an absolute gift to do what they'd always wanted to do, which was to get rid of Jonathan Slater.
And what's been the reaction in the party?
Well, there are some Conservative MPs who are supportive of this. I spoke to one former minister who said, look, I never really rated Jonathan Slater, but he is, this person said, a very, very nice bloke. Other Tories are absolutely horrified. One Tory said of the removal of Jonathan Slater, which is the latest in a series of permanent secretaries, as Lewis was saying, to be removed, what this MP said to me, it's a polite form of British terrorism. Nobody gets killed, but it's quite a way of keeping people under control. And one former cabinet minister said of the removal of all those permanent secretaries, it's like a British cultural revolution. If you're on side, fine. If you're not, you're out. But this former minister did say to me they think this is going to be counterproductive. They predict an exodus of senior civil servants from the civil service. There's a sort of a 3-year scheme where you can go into the private sector. A lot of civil servants going after that, this former minister told me. And also they said that they think that those civil servants, senior civil servants who remain, they'll keep their heads down, which means ministers won't get the robust advice that the civil service are meant to give them.
Well, thanks, Nick. And we've got Dave Penman here, who's the General Secretary of the FDA Union, which represents civil servants. Dave Penman, what's your reaction to the departure, the sacking of Jonathan Slater?
I think it's quite extraordinary, to be honest, given the removal yesterday of the Chief Executive of Ofqual as well. So we have a situation where this is not as a result of some investigation, some determination of where blame should lie. Those are complex problems that resulted in the A-levels and GCSE fiasco. They need proper analysis, and perhaps at that point in time, people have to be accountable, whether that's ministers or civil servants. This is simply scapegoating. This is simply the Prime Minister determining that civil service heads will roll to save a minister. And that's as clear as day to the rest of the civil service as well. So I think not only is this not good for government, I think it will have very long-term implications for the civil service.
But I suppose you could, well, what would you say?
I think taken together with the other departures, it's quite clear that this government is treating the civil service in a different way from previous governments. It started when Johnson came in, the briefing against individuals, the briefing against the civil service as an organisation. There was the list that was put out in the Sunday Telegraph, earlier on in the year, of a hit list of permanent secretaries that were gone. And as each one goes and each one is sacrificed, then the trust that should be there between civil servants and ministers, because ministers know civil servants can't defend themselves, they can't speak out publicly, they're not allowed to speak publicly to defend themselves. That trust that's required for effective government just simply gets eroded every time.
So you think not open to new ideas?
I think it's interesting, they talk about cognitive diversity, and increasingly it looks like we just want people who think like us, to be honest. I just can't believe this is a coincidence. I don't think they care, to be honest. I think they're quite happy to go to war with the civil service. I think this government is strange. You know, it's part of a 10-year tenure of a Conservative government, but it feels very different. I think if you look at those around the Prime Minister who were from the kind of Leave group, they were very distrustful of the civil service around that, and I think they've carried that in. So they're quite happy to see this revolution, but it's not reform, it's simply removing individuals who either they don't rate or they don't trust, and to bringing in people that they do.
They could see the civil service as obstructive, and perhaps they are obstructive.
Well, if that's the case, that would have been the conclusion of the Minister and why Jonathan Slater was removed. There is no such conclusion that's been reached. There's no such investigation. No civil servant has been offered the opportunity to explain what advice they gave. And at the end of the day, civil servants only advise. Ministers make decisions. If there is accountability, that's not just for civil servants, it's for ministers as well. But, you know, there are not two sides to that coin, increasingly. It's just civil servants being sacrificed.
Although he was in charge of the department where the mess up happened, Kenneth Baker, former Education Secretary, said on Good Morning Britain last week that Ofqual had made a mess of it. Gavin Williamson wasn't involved in the algorithm and the DfE did not scrutinise it carefully.
I don't think he knows the detail of what happened in a very complex issue. You know, this has been an issue that has created issues for all the devolved governments as well. We recognise the complexity around that. As ever, in government, the things that go wrong are for complex reasons. And therefore, if you want to look at accountability, particularly in terms of is it officials who should be accountable or ministers, you need to look at a lot of issues to determine where that accountability lies. But that's not what this is about. Let's not pretend this is about accountability for the exams fiasco. This is about saving a ministerial skin and the government sending a clear message to the civil service that you will be thrown under a bus when it becomes politically convenient.
So what is the mood across Whitehall then?
I think very distrustful. I think, as indicated earlier, I think lots of civil servants will be thinking about, is this the organisation that I want to work for? People commit a life to work in the civil service and public service. They also expect that ministers will have their back. They know that they cannot defend themselves. They can't go on the airwaves and say, this is what happened or that's the advice I gave. And they expect ministers, therefore, when things go wrong, as they always do in government, to have their back, to deal with it maturely, to look at what went wrong. And if there is accountability, civil servants are happy to be held accountable for the advice they gave. But only if that's a fair game, only if ministers are going to be held accountable for the decisions that they made as well.
So do you think Gavin Williamson should resign?
That's a matter for the Prime Minister. I don't think it's fair that civil servants are attacked in this way, and I don't think ministers should as well. I think we need to find out what went wrong, and if what went wrong lies at the door of the minister, that's when the Prime Minister should be making a decision about Gavin Williamson, not as a knee-jerk reaction. And that's why, as a knee-jerk reaction, the civil servants shouldn't have been abandoned as well.
Dave Penman, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.